Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Sarah Cole. I'm an Associate Curator of Antiquities here at the Getty Villa Museum, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's program, Reel to Real Spartacus, Thracian, Gladiator, Freedom Fighter. So before I welcome today's speaker, I wanted to say a few words of introduction about the exhibition to which today's program is related. The current special exhibition here at the Getty Villa Museum is Ancient Thrace and the Classical World, Treasures from Bulgaria, Romania, and Greece. And this exhibition is an official partnership between the Getty and the Ministry of Culture of the Republic of Bulgaria, as well as with the National Archaeological Institute with Museum at the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences. So many of you may be wondering, where is Thrace? What is Thrace? So Thrace is a name for an ancient region, which you see highlighted on this map here. And the Thracian peoples occupied most of what is today Bulgaria, as well as parts of Romania, Greece, and Turkey. And as you can see, it was located at the intersection of many different regions and cultures and civilizations, and was highly interconnected with these, which is a major focus of the exhibition. This is a view from our galleries. The exhibition is on view here at the Villa Museum on the second floor through the 3rd of March, 2025, and it includes loans from 14 different Bulgarian museums, as well as significant loans from Romania and Greece. This is another view of the entrance into the exhibition. We begin in the late Bronze Age, around 1500 BCE, when we start to see spectacular objects like this gold treasure hoard of drinking and banqueting vessels known as the Vulcatron treasure. In antiquity, Thrace was known for its rich metal resources, particularly gold, silver, and copper, and Thracian artisans became very skilled at working with these materials, so we have a lot of really spectacular gold and silver and bronze objects in the exhibition. The Thracians were also known as skilled warriors and horsemen. The second gallery of the exhibition focuses on rich tomb finds from the burials of royal and aristocratic Thracians. We have a small gallery dedicated to a group of significant loans from a tumulus burial in Romania. And the final gallery of the exhibition features some of the most famous Thracian treasure hoards, particularly the gold Panagiriște treasure, which you can see to the left of center on this image. And then we bring the exhibition to a chronological conclusion by talking about Thrace when it becomes part of the Roman Empire. So from beginning to end, the exhibition covers a period from about 1500 BCE to 200 CE, over a millennium and a half of history. And we hope that this exhibition, which is the first Thrace-focused exhibition to take place on the west coast of the United States, will introduce Thrace to new audiences and also help bring Thrace more into the mainstream of conversation about ancient Mediterranean history. So the final section of this exhibition, which talks about Thrace when it comes under the influence and eventually the control of Rome, segues nicely into the topic of today's talk, the 1960 Stanley Kubrick film Spartacus, because Spartacus was a Thracian. Spartacus lived in the 1st century BCE. He came from Thrace and was enslaved by the Romans and forced to train and fight as a gladiator, and led a slave revolt against the Romans. We don't have any artifacts associated with Spartacus, but I'm showing on the screen here a few examples of Thracian arms and armor that we do have on display in the exhibition. So Spartacus is one of the very few historic Thracian individuals whose name we know and whose life we know something about. So today we will be talking about the making and the legacy of the film Spartacus. So now I'm very pleased to welcome today's speaker, Dr. Monica Cyrino, who is a professor of classics at the University of New Mexico. Her scholarly research centers on the reception of the ancient world in film and television. She is the author of Big Screen Rome, published in 2005, and the editor of Rome Season 1, History Makes Television, Screening Love and Sex in the Ancient World, and Rome Season 2, Trial and Triumph. and she is also the co-editor of Classical Myth on Screen, stars Spartacus, reimagining an icon on screen, and screening Love and War in Troy, Fall of a City. She has served as an academic consultant on several recent films and television productions, so we're very excited to hear from her today about Spartacus and its legacy in film. So with that, please welcome to the stage Dr. Monica Cyrino.
Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Good afternoon. I'm Monica Cyrino. It is delightful to be here in my home of Southern California to address you this afternoon to talk about a film that is near and dear to my heart. Just a couple of thank yous really quickly. Thanks to the Getty Villa for inviting me to present this talk this afternoon. Thank you to Sarah for that wonderful introduction and for curating a beautiful exhibit that I hope you all got a chance to see or can see a little bit later. Thanks also to some of the staff who reached out to me, to Shelby Brown, to Lisa Koss, and to Aram Atamian, who reached out to me and said, you know, we'd like you to talk about Spartacus. And I said, you mean the old movie Spartacus? The movie that is about 64 years old now? Are you sure you don't want to talk about the new Gladiator? And no, we have this thing going on with Thrace, so we want to talk about that. So showing you here a reference to Spartacus as Sarah mentioned, one of the only named Thracians that we have from this period, the Roman period, and then one of the famous one-sheets movie posters from the original film. So when we, let's see if I can do this correctly. Here we go. When we think about the film Spartacus, what I want to do today is talk about the film where it sits on what we call a reception thread, a sort of thread of reception. The film sits in a place that looks both backwards to the actual history of Spartacus. We do have some historical records about Spartacus. Many of them are late, many of them are contradictory. I'll talk a little bit about that. But the film looks backwards to that real history. It also looks backwards to the reception thread of the numerous ways that Spartacus as a character, as a figure, has been resuscitated, revived, and reused by various different media over the centuries. We're talking stage plays, earlier films, etc., this kind of thing. And then Spartacus also looks forward on this reception thread in the sense that it was such an important film coming out as it did in 1960 that it looked forward to a number of other reuses of the material from the film, the fact that the film was so influential in terms of art, in terms of politics, in terms of sexuality. But the first thing to think about is, picture it, October 6th, 1960. That was even before I was born, you guys, and I am older than Caracalla. So for those of you who were around back then or remember, on October 6th, 1960, this theatrical print of the theatrical release of Stanley Kubrick's Spartacus premiered in New York at the DeMille Theater. And I was thinking about this morning. I thought, well, the movie Spartacus is a Libra. It was born on October 6, 1960. And like a lot of Libras, it is beautiful to look at. It's very intelligent. This movie is very intelligent. It's aesthetically innovative. It's sort of iconoclastic. It's very justice-seeking and very focused on equity and justice. But at the same time, like some of our Libra friends, it can be argumentative, controversial, really not knowing where it stands on some of the issues, as we shall see. There are a lot of ambiguities about this film. What What is it saying about the fight for freedom? Is the fight for freedom good? Is it hard? Is it bad? Do you die, right? Is it worth it, right? So all of these big questions, these big argumentative, sort of, sort of divisive, sort of controversial questions are being asked by this film that we're going to talk about today. And I'm so happy to just walk through the gallery with Sarah to see so many of the mounted figures, the Thracian mounted figures, because you really see that in the iconography of the film too, in a number of these promotional posters that I'm going to show you. Okay, I'm going to show you a whole bunch of beautiful pictures today. Most of these photos are from the archives from Brenna Productions and from Universal Pictures Studios. So we'll have some citations for you later on. So when we think about the film, the 1960 film Spartacus, we have to think about Kirk Douglas and his famous chin. You guys all know about his famous, beautiful chin. So the story goes. So here's the Hollywood gossip portion of the talk. The story goes that Kirk Douglas, in the late 1950s, was already a big star. Right, had starred in a number of important films. Was kind of a big deal in Hollywood, and he was a little miffed. And he says this in his memoirs. He was a little upset that he did not get cast as Judah Ben-Hur in William Wyler's blockbuster, major, 10 Oscar-winning film Ben-Hur from 1959. How many of you still watch Ben-Hur every year? Right, the best film that was ever made. I must say myself. All right. So Kirk Douglas was a little upset. He knew William Wyler. They had worked together, and he was a little upset that he did not get to star as Judah Ben-Hur, this hero who fought against Roman oppression. And so he cast around immediately to try and find some IP, some intellectual property for a film based on an ancient character who fought against Roman oppression. And sure enough, there was a novel that had just been reissued called Spartacus about the ancient historical figure Spartacus, who fought against the Roman regime, in this case Republican Rome, and Kirk Douglas paid his own money to buy the property so that he could star as Spartacus. There was a little bit of a controversy also going on. As you all know, in Hollywood, nothing ever gets made in ones, everything gets made in twos. There's always two competing projects. There was another project at United Artists, another Spartacus project, was going to star Yul Brynner. All right, you guys all know who Yul Brynner is? Yes, all right. We're firmly in the Hollywood gossip portion now. Okay, so, and Kirk Douglas was like, no, we've got to beat them, right? So he went very quickly and moved very quickly to put together a stellar cast, a director, I'll talk about all of that, and the writers and so forth for his version of of Spartacus. And so that's how it came about, that Kirk Douglas wanted to create a film, star in a film, produce a film that would be about a freedom fighter fighting against, in the ancient times, fighting against Roman oppression. And that's how he came up with this particular story of Spartacus. And it is very important to remember that he retained almost 100% of creative control. I would say 98% of creative control over this, the making of this film. And you can find this in his memoirs and so forth. So what Kirk Douglas did in this kind of rush to get this movie together, and so I'm going to give you a little background to how the movie was made, and then we'll talk about the actual film. In this rush to get the movie put together and get a team put together, he was first with Universal Pictures, Universal Studios. You can still go over there today. Universal Studios, Universal Pictures recommended that he hire a director called Anthony Mann. Anthony Mann, a famous director from the 1950s, directed a lot of Western films, and he lasted about 2 or 3 weeks on this production. Kirk Douglas did not think that he had the right right idea for what Kirk Douglas wanted to do on this film, and so Anthony Mann was replaced after doing some of the first few shots in Death Valley that were shot in Death Valley of the North African mines where Spartacus is enslaved. He was replaced by a young and up-and-coming director called Stanley Kubrick, who was a photographer, a very young man, had directed a few pictures in the 1950s, but nothing on the epic scale. None of the big studios would trust him. You know, he was kind of young, kind of green, kind of weird, and none of the big studios would trust him with a big epic film such as Spartacus. Well, Kirk Douglas had worked with Stanley Kubrick on an anti-war film in 1959 called Paths of Glory. Some of you have seen that film, and so Kirk Douglas remembered him. He liked working with him, and so he invited Stanley Kubrick to direct this film. Now, as many of you know, because of seeing documentaries and so forth, Stanley Kubrick sort of disowned this film. He did not consider Spartacus to be one of his films that he liked, that he felt that he could be proud of. And for many years, he talked about what a bad time he had doing this film. He did not include it in his sort of top 10 best of collections and so forth. And for many years, he talked about how he was upset that he had very little creative control, which all fell into the hands of Kirk Douglas. Before his death in the late 1990s, he sort of came around and appreciated Spartacus as a film a little bit more, especially in his contribution to help with the 1991 restoration, which was one of the best restorations of the film. He contributed some of his own personal archival materials to that restoration. But for a long time, he was not very happy about what he had contributed on this film. But there is no doubt that when you see this film, it is absolutely, just sort of infused with that Kubrickian sense of the visual sense of Stanley Kubrick's wonderful eye, his way of doing wide-angle shots, his fascination with crowd scenes, with battle scenes, his meticulous sense of visual artistry, his shadows, his lights, et cetera, et cetera. The dialogue, the script, and so forth, the story, way much more to Kirk Douglas and to the writer, Dalton Trumbo. I'll talk about him in a minute. But the visual artistry of Stanley Kubrick, as you know from some of his other famous films, I just put a little montage up there for you. I don't need to remind you about all his films. It is very evident, and you'll be able to see that today in the stills and the clips that I will show you. So, moving forward, just a couple of other little bits of cinematographica here, some little info for you to know, and that is that the film, when it was made, it cost about $12 million. Again, that was a huge amount of money in 1950s dollars. In 1959, one estimate I saw, I never know how they figure out these estimates, but it would be like about $100 million today, or over $100 million. And so this was a huge gamble for the studio at a time when epic films were sort of falling out of favor, right? As we know from the debacle that was the Cleopatra film just a couple years later, it was sort of falling out of favor in terms of taste. But it did very well at the box office in 1960, made $60 million, still is making money, was nominated for 6 Academy Awards and won 4 Academy Awards, one of which was for Peter Ustinov in the character of Batiatus, the Lanista figure, the Gladiator school owner. There he is with Shirley Jones, who won Best Supporting Actress that year as well. So the film won 4 Oscars, nominated for 6, Best Supporting Actor, Cinematography, Art Direction, which is called Production Design today. Back in the day, it was called Art Direction, and then Costumes, of course. So from the very beginning, Kirk Douglas, as the producer, as the sort of creative intelligence behind the film, wanted to make a film about the universal human struggle for freedom, right? Set in the story of these enslaved rebels against Roman authority, but standing for a much larger set of political circumstances in the 1940s and 1950s in the United States of America, but again, also a culmination of a long history of Spartacus as a figure being used as a symbol of the fight for freedom and the human desire for freedom. So here's just a couple of these beautiful one-sheets showing, you know, the broken chains and so forth. So for those of you, especially with a good aesthetic eye, you can see the way that the film's visual aspects, the sort of extra cinematic productions that they did as far as advertising and so forth, really reaffirmed the idea of this sort of life and death struggle of the enslaved people against the pitiless Roman regime. So, the film was based on a novel that was published in 1951 by novelist Howard Fast. Howard Fast was a, let's see if I have a, oh, there's the cover of the novel there. Howard Fast self-published this novel in 1951 because he was blacklisted during the late 1940s, early, and then throughout the 1950s. I think I have another, yeah, there we go. Yes, so Howard Fast refused to give names of fellow members of the Communist Party and was imprisoned for contempt of Congress for 3 months in 1950. And during that time that he was in jail, okay, he started to write the novel Spartacus. And so when he got out, he finished writing the novel and then self-published it in 1951. It still remains one of the most successful self-published novels in the history of publishing in the United States of America. In 1958, as I mentioned, the novel was reissued and published by Crown Publishers with his name on it, actually. So it was a sort of a way of sort of ending the blacklist for Howard Fast. Kirk Douglas would, as we're going to see, would sort of boast that he ended the blacklist all single-handedly, but there were a lot of other, you know, a lot of other elements contributing to the end of the blacklist at this point in the U.S. Kirk Douglas then reached out to, he picked up the novel in 1958 when it was republished. He bought the rights with his own money. He asked Howard Fast to write a treatment. This is what they call in Hollywood land, you know, a sort of abstract of what a movie would look like from a novel. Kirk Douglas was not happy with Howard Fast's treatment. It was a little too novel-y. And so he reached out to another very famous and blacklisted writer, and this was the screenwriter Dalton Trumbo. By the way, let me just point out that in 2015, there was a brilliant movie called Trumbo. If this is not on your Netflix list, put it immediately on your Netflix list, starring Bryan Cranston, you know, from Breaking Bad, as Dalton Trumbo. It's a great film, and there are cameos of Kirk Douglas and so forth in the film. It's really, really a great film. So, Kirk Douglas reaches out to Dalton Trumbo to write the actual screenplay for Spartacus. So Dalton Trumbo was also blacklisted by the House Un-American Activities Committee for not naming names, giving out more names of left-leaning socialist and communist writers in Hollywood, and he was counted among something that historians call the famous Hollywood 10 writers and directors and other Hollywood creatives who were blacklisted for refusing to testify in 1947. So in 1950, he went to jail. He served 11 months in federal prison. He was blacklisted all throughout the 1950s. Here's another book that might be of interest to you, and here he is checking in for his non-testimony at the committee. And so when Spartacus actually came out in 1960, Dalton Trumbo's name was actually put on the screenplay for the first time in 13 years. He got to use his own name. Just as an aside, in 1953, he did write the screenplay for probably my favorite movie, Roman Holiday, for which he won an Oscar, but he didn't win an Oscar. His front man, Ian McClellan Hunter, picked up the Oscar for him, and this was reinstated to him posthumously to his family in 1993, his screenwriting Oscar for the wonderful film Roman Holiday. So so this is the first time that that Trumbo's name was credited in his real name in 13 years after being blacklisted. So what you can see happening here is that, Kirk Douglas, and of course he took a lot of credit for this, and he writes about it in his memoirs, how he single-handedly broke the blacklist. Well, he really did use his Hollywood clout to help these writers somewhat provocatively, hiring them and crediting them by their names for the first time in a number of years. But there were a lot of other forces at work in American society, in American media society, and so forth, that contributed to this as well. By the way, Howard Fast and Dalton Trumbo did not like each other, just so you don't think this is a big kumbaya moment of everyone getting together and fighting against oppression. We're told that they didn't really like each other very much. But Kirk Douglas did see this as part of the leitmotif of the film itself, that Spartacus and the rebels fighting against Roman authority, that Kirk Douglas himself, along with these blacklisted writers and other creative people in Hollywood, also fighting against the oppression of the American government at this time. So so just wanted to put a couple more images up there for you that Kirk Douglas does take credit for this. And there's also a wonderful story about a newly elected President John F. Kennedy in November of 1960, crossing picket lines just like this one to go and see the film in New York, making a big statement. A lot of photographs were taken, sort of showing a new decade, a new sort of movement, a new openness in American society. Wouldn't that be nice? We would all love to have that. So, in terms of the real history, real R-E-A-L of Spartacus, in terms of the real history, Sarah gave you a little bit of background about what we know about Spartacus, which is not very much. We do know that Roman society, starting in around, 146 BC or so, when Rome sacked Corinth and just started importing massive amounts of enslaved persons from all over the Mediterranean, were pouring into Rome, and it fundamentally changed the economy, the ancient Roman economy, where small sort of family farmers kind of turned into these huge plantations, which are called latifundia, just worked by slaves, held in increasingly fewer and fewer hands of increasingly richer and richer Roman citizens, using slave labor to work their farms. So there were a series of slave revolts, or revolts by enslaved persons, agricultural slaves, in the history of Rome. A couple of very famous ones that happened on the island of Sicily, which was sort of a breadbasket for the ancient Romans. But the Spartacus slave revolt, or slave rebellion, which is sometimes called the Spartacus War, the Spartacus Slave War, or sometimes the Third Servile War. So I wanted you to know that there were three big ones, and this one was probably the biggest and the most, the scariest for the Romans, because it took place on the mainland, right, starting in Campania and then all throughout southern Italy, and it really shook Rome to its core. It really frightened the Roman government. It took a little while, but they really got scared after a while. Many Romans were killed, had their farms looted. It was a real problem for Roman society. Now, the fact that it did not work, okay, sorry, spoiler alert, Spartacus and the slaves were not successful in their rebellion against the Roman government at this time. Doesn't take away from the fact that this was a very big event and one that has been written about quite a bit. If you want to read some more about it, there's been a lot of coverage, including Barry Strauss's very famous book about the rebellion. So, starting in 73 BC, Spartacus, who, as Sarah mentioned, was a Thracian by birth, was captured by the Romans on one of these Roman, campaigns that were taking place all over the Mediterranean world to gather more and more slaves to take back to Rome. He was enslaved, brought back to Rome, and then because of his size and strength, we are told, he was chosen to train at the Gladiator school in Capua, which is south of, it's sort of like the ocean side to LA. It's a very wealthy kind of La Jolla kind of little town in Campania, south of Rome. So he trained there. We are told from the sources, which are mostly about 100 years later in Plutarch and in Appian, that about 70 to 80 gladiators escaped with Spartacus from the gladiator school, which is known as a ludus. Put the Latin word up there for you if you want a little Latin in your afternoon. He then led this revolt of mostly foreign-born slaves, together with his second in command, a Gallic slave named Crixus. So they were mostly from all over the place, and they broke out of the school. They camped on the backside of Mount Vesuvius. You can see here there are still some ruins at Capua of the gladiator school, the gladiator arena. It's a little bit later than this period, but it's still kind of cool to go there and to take your students there if you ever want to do that. So they camped on the back side of Mount Vesuvius, and they held off the Roman army for about a year. So they were very successful with this. In terms of Spartacus himself, there's the AI-generated Spartacus. I thought that was he's kind of handsome there, so I want you guys to see him. So who was this guy? So Sarah mentioned that he was trained as a gladiator. In some of the sources, we are told that Spartacus had to have been also a mercenary in the Roman army. So is this something that the Romans told themselves so that they could excuse the fact that he was so good, right, and that he won so many battles against them during this 2-year period? We don't know. We do know that Spartacus does seem to have been a fairly skilled military tactician, and so it is possible, it could be even likely, that he served for a little while in a Roman auxiliary legion, but we just can't know that for sure. He trained as a heavy armed gladiator, something called a murmillo, with a big shield and a sword, and all of these legends sort of grew up around him, again, mostly for the Romans, I think, to sort of, kind of tell themselves that it was okay, to fight against this guy and his rebel army because he was such an amazing, specimen himself. So many of the historical sources are quite actually sort of flattering about Spartacus. So that's kind of an interesting thing, and I think another thing that lends some, sort of glamour to the image that we have of him going forward. For the first year or so during the revolt, Spartacus and the escaped gladiators who sort of formed the core of the sort of military hierarchy of the rebel army, they grew to, by some estimates, 70,000. Some other historians put the estimate even higher than that, because enslaved people were escaping from all over the latifundia, the farms, the houses, the villas, all over southern Italy, even from Rome itself, and joining the army that Spartacus was leading, that was head of. And for about a year, they won several important battles. And I just mention this here because almost all of these battles that were shot by Stanley Kubrick to be in the film Spartacus were later cut by the studio censors. They said because they were too violent, but it might have had a political reason reason that we could talk about in a minute. But there were at least 4 major battles at Nola, at Nuceria, at Metapontum, and at Thurii that were major victories for Spartacus and his rebel army. This could have been because at first the Romans did not take them very seriously. They're like, they're just a bunch of slaves. And you see this repeated actually in the dialogue in the film, right? And so they sort of treated it as a police action, like, yeah, we'll send the Coast Guard down there or something, right? We'll send the National Guard or something. And so it took a while before the Roman Senate sent a senatorial legion that had, serious, well-trained Roman legions. It took them quite a while to take this seriously. So for about a year and a half, Spartacus and his army went around and won several major battles against the Roman army and Roman legions. Finally, in 71 BC, the Roman Senate got serious. They sent a consul named Marcus Licinius Crassus, whose bust you see there and whom you also see up in the top there as played by Laurence Olivier in the film. They sent Crassus after Spartacus. Crassus was aided in this by Pompey Magnus, also another famous Roman general who marched down from Rome from his legions. Crassus blockaded the toe of Italy, which is, I think, today known as Calabria. Back then it was called Bruttium. Spartacus and his armies were trapped in the toe of Italy, and in a final huge battle then was fought somewhere down there. Several towns down there sort of, vie for the credit of where the actual final battle took place. We're not quite sure exactly where it took place, but somewhere down in near the toe of Italy. The entire army of Spartacus was defeated, was wiped out. Spartacus, we are told in all the sources, was defeated in battle. He was not crucified, as you see in the film, so that's a major change that the film does. He was killed in battle, and one of the sources says that, Appian says, his body was never found, all right? We do know that Crassus then, to make an example of the rebels, crucified 6,000 persons on the road. It's like, like the 405 from here down to La Jolla. On the Via Appia, the main road leading back up to Rome, was littered with 6,000 crosses all the way from Capua back to Rome to make an example of what not to do against the Roman army, all right? So, in terms of the legacy of Spartacus and his epic significance, why is he, yeah, there's my bookshelf. Why is he so influential? Well, it's kind of an interesting fact that Spartacus doesn't get mentioned in the standard Roman histories for several centuries afterwards. Some people suggest it was because it was just kind of embarrassing to the Romans that they, were so close to being defeated and were defeated in a number of battles against a slave. He was just a slave, as they say in the film. So it's kind of a provocative, fact, I think, that the Romans don't talk very much about Spartacus for many, many, many centuries. But he does end up becoming a very important figure as we move forward into the later centuries, starting in around the 1700s, where you start to see Spartacus as a figure of the sort of working man, the working person. I guess I don't have to be sexist there. A sort of martyr of the proletariat, a freedom fighter, a revolutionary, kind of taking on different shades of difference depending on which century we're moving into. So hold on to your hats. We're going to go zipping through a bunch of centuries right now so I can give you a couple more influential moments of Spartacus's reception thread throughout the more recent centuries. So in the 1700s, Spartacus starts to be utilized kind of out of the blue. It's kind of an interesting sort of resurrection of the figure of Spartacus when revolutionary ideals were sweeping through Europe and as well as in our country here. And Spartacus becomes very important in revolutionary debates, in anti-slavery debates. The very famous anti-slavery freedom fighter Toussaint Louverture, I apologize for my terrible French pronunciation, who led the revolt on the island of Haiti, the first free nation state in the Caribbean, which was Haiti, which was formed in 1804. The revolt started in 1791. You see also some imagery of Spartacus being used in discourses even in the American context in terms of Abraham Lincoln as a mounted Thracian, you can see there, leading the slaves to freedom. So Spartacus, a symbol of individual liberty, a person's right to not be enslaved, to have their own personal autonomy. As we move into the 1800s, we start to see Spartacus being sort of utilized more in terms of discourse of nationalism and sort of national independence from other controlling colonial enterprises, let's put it that way. Spartacus was used in a number of media by the American colonists, but was really popular in the late 1800s with Italian nationalists, especially with the Italian Risorgimento movement. A number of novels were written about Spartacus, and these formed the basis for a number of early films, early Italian films. Spartacus was very popular with early Italian filmmakers, like the 1913 silent film directed by Enrico Videlli. You can see some of these in various archives if you're interested in that. But so moving from a figure of individual liberty to a figure of national independence is kind of an interesting, sort of job description for Spartacus moving forward. And then as you move into the 1900s, you start to see Spartacus being associated with the workers' movement, with the idea of more of a sort of Marxist ideology, or Spartacus as a sort of hero of the proletariat. And so you start to see, here's a couple of images here just to suggest to you the way that the name of Spartacus and quotes from the novel and so forth were used. So used by labor leaders, by union activists, Spartacus becomes more of a symbol of the class struggle. And you will see, Spartacus's name invoked wherever workers are oppressed. The famous German Spartacist League, the Irish Spartacist League. This name, Spartacus, right, being used all over, especially in World War I, to suggest this sort of class struggle and the movement, the labor movement and union activism, etc. So when you get actually to the 1950s and the early 1960s, of course the film comes out in 1960, we see that Spartacus then also the film engages with the current theme of civil rights. So we'll talk about that a little bit when we get to the film as well. So when we look at the film, let's move on to the film now itself. With an all-star cast, I think you can probably recognize every single name that is listed on these beautiful Roman coins in this one one sheet there as well, with Kirk Douglas in the named role of Spartacus, Laurence Olivier as Crassus, Gene Simmons also playing his wife, and several other figures that we'll get to as we go through. So I'm going to keep going. Stanley Kubrick, when he was brought in to direct the film after a couple of weeks that shooting started, he was very concerned that the visual element of the film be highlighted, that the mythic quality be retained. And in that, he had a little bit of conflict with Clint Eastwood. Kirk Douglas, sorry, he would have had a conflict with them. With Kirk Douglas, in that Kirk Douglas wanted, a very developed and very wordy script, and Kubrick wanted to have a lot of scenes that did not have very much dialogue. I was delighted when we walked into the lecture hall today to hear strains of the overture of the score of Spartacus. The composer Alex North was brought in to compose a very harsh-sounding epic score, very famous for Western movies. You can notice the Western-sounding theme when you listen to this, when you watch the film and listen to the score. This is the cover of the album for the score, and several of the leitmotifs that Alex North used in the film are still played today by jazz musicians, especially the love themes and so forth from the film. He was also nominated for an Oscar that year, but did not win. The opening titles of the film, my students always get kind of upset by these opening titles because they're very dark, they're very schematic. There's this sort of, almost, leaning into the 1960s kind of imagery with these very tough images. A fist for Spartacus, a jar for Verinia. The breaking eye. There's a crumbling eye when it says Stanley Kubrick, and then the eye sort of crumbles. Perhaps suggesting that film is not the easiest way to talk about some of these ancient topics that we have to talk about. But again, it signals that we're moving into a different aesthetic with this new film. What we see in the opening scenes that were directed by Anthony Mann, as I mentioned to you, shot in Death Valley. Of course, you can all recognize the color of the stone there. Spartacus is, we are told, by a voiceover, which was added later in the filming against Kubrick's desires. He did not want that. But they added an opening voiceover where they say, the masculine voice says that Spartacus was born a slave. All right, so this is not the case from the historical record as we have it. The movie again wants to emphasize the fight from slavery to freedom by indicating that Spartacus was in fact in this condition from birth. So that is a little bit of a difference. Several of these images from those opening shots, those opening scenes, emphasize the major theme that we have of freedom versus slavery. Spartacus is, trying to help another enslaved person in this scene, of course, and tries to fight his way to help another enslaved person. He's spotted by the ludus owner, who's looking for brawny specimens to take back to his school to train as gladiators. But right from the outset, we get the theme that Kirk Douglas wanted, emphasized, which is that of human dignity, human agency, humans, compassionately wanting to protect each other, which is what the character of Spartacus does right from the beginning. Spartacus is taken to the ludus. Remember, ludus is the Roman word for gladiator school, where he is trained as an elite gladiator. You can see this wonderful shot of the gladiator training area made to look like a cage, right? You guys can see the bars all the way around it, emphasized what Stanley Kubrick wanted to emphasize was this sense of restriction, of being caged, of not having free movement, and so forth. And so many of the shots will be shot from the point of view of the enslaved gladiators, but with the prongs, or whatever you want to call them, the bars of the enclosure, showing that they had no freedom of movement, right? In the ludus, in the gladiator school. So the character of the lanista, right? Lanista is the owner or the trainer figure that you see in the film. A historical named character that we have from the sources, Lentulus Batiatus, pronounced Batiatus in the film with a kind of more British pronunciation. You will see it pronounced Batiatus and some other evocations of the Spartacus myth or legend in other TV shows and so forth. Peter Ustinov, who played Nero back in Quo Vadis in 1951, you guys remember that? We all remember it. Shows up again in a toga to be the lanista figure. And of course, the lanista figure is a very important figure in all gladiator movies. We see from the movie Gladiator, Oliver Reed up there in the top corner, from the original movie Gladiator in 2000 with Russell Crowe, John Hannah from the television show Spartacus as the lanista Batiatus there, and then even Denzel Washington in the more recent new Gladiator that just came out last week, playing Macrinus, the lanista figure. And the relationship of our gladiator hero with this figure is always very important, a very important trope in any gladiator film. So, just a little bit of something that carries over from film to film. And yeah, just as a reminder, Ustinov won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. Here he is with Charles Laughton, who also played Nero in an early film in the 1930s, The Sign of the Cross. So it's kind of cool to see two Neros together on screen for film nerds. So Spartacus is treated visually and in dialogue like an animal, right? The famous line where he says, "I am not an animal," right? Again, the cinematography emphasizes the bars and so forth surrounding the enslaved gladiators in the ludus. Even when they escape, they have to go over the top of the bars. So Kubrick made a real point to sort of show the restriction, how they felt encaged and so forth, to give that sense of their lack of freedom, and how much more wonderful it was once they broke out. And one of my favorite shots, one of my favorite scenes, a number of Romans show up and ask for a fight to the death. And you can see the women who choose the gladiators that they want to fight to the death, and they peer through the bars in the ludus. This is also another very important trope that we see in gladiator films, and that is where the gaze is sort of reversed from a male gaze onto female bodies. We have both male and female in the camera gaze gazing at male bodies. So this becomes a very important trope, visual trope, in gladiator films and television shows moving forward after Spartacus. Spartacus falls in love with another enslaved person, the character Varinia, who is not historical, does not come down to us in the historical sources, but is in Howard Fast's novel. We do have a reference to Spartacus's wife in the historical sources, but not by name. She's played by Jean Simmons. There were a couple of other actresses that started on set before Jean Simmons was brought on, but that's more Hollywood gossip that you can look up yourself. Spartacus and Varinia fall in love. Of course, they can't form any real bond, any real sort of family bond, because they're both enslaved persons, and they spend some time, gazing at each other longingly in the moments that they can in the kitchen. Again, look at that shot. You can see the bars on the outside, emphasizing that they do not have freedom. In one of the most important scenes in the film is when these elite Roman VIPs show up. They demand a fight to the death. As most of you know from your Roman history, most gladiators did not fight to the death, right? It was very rare to fight to the death. They were very expensive to keep and train and to show and so forth. So probably fewer than 10 or 15% of gladiators actually died in the ring. So when these elite Roman VIPs show up and they order a fight to the death. This causes a great deal of consternation and a challenge to morale in the ludus there. The group is led by Marcus Licinius Crassus, the historical figure that we know will lead the Roman legions finally lead them against Spartacus and finally beat Spartacus. He shows up. He is this very arrogant, power-mad sort of, figure played by one of the greatest actors of all time, Laurence Olivier, and he immediately takes a shine to Varinia and buys her spot on, just, pays for her right away. Name your price, he says to Batiatus, and he says, send her to my house tomorrow. So this is another sort of, turning point or a moment of crisis that will cause the rebellion. So when the Roman VIPs demand that the gladiators fight to the death, we see this scene shot from the point of view of the Roman VIPs up in their hierarchical sort of, vertical axis box, looking down, and some of them aren't even paying attention. Crassus is talking to the other one, Marcus Glabrus here, just talking about Roman politics. They're not even paying attention that there are going to be two gladiators that end up, that they watch two matched pairs, two gladiators will end up dead. It's a life and death situation for them. You see one of the Roman elite women there giving the thumbs down signal when Draba then pins Spartacus against the wall. So Spartacus and Draba, the two fighters that are shown in this very important scene. You can see here the axis of the fighters down in the pit and the Roman VIPs up in their sort of, their VIP box like at Dodger Stadium or whatever. They're way up high. They're not friends, right? They're not allowed to be friends. The gladiators can't make friends because one of them might have to kill another. But they do express that there is honor in their brotherhood, in the fact that they are all going through the same thing and they all want, the dignity of their own human freedom. So in this scene where Spartacus is pinned against the wall by Draba, we actually see Kubrick shot several of the shots were through the net that is used by Draba, so we know where this is going, that Draba is going to actually get the better of Spartacus, and Spartacus should die in this scene, but he doesn't, right? Draba pins him to the side of the enclosure and is commanded by the Roman VIPs to kill him, but he doesn't do that. In fact, he throws his trident up into the VIP box in an act of civil disobedience, in an act of agency and freedom, and an act that ends up with the Romans then grabbing him and killing him. The actor Woody Strode, who plays Draba in this scene, would have been recognizable to audiences as an actor, but also as a sort of hero of the Black Pride movement and civil rights movement, as one of the UCLA teammates that joined in breaking the color barrier in national sports. You can see there Woody Strode on the left and Jackie Robinson in the middle and Kenny Washington on the right. Kenny Washington and Woody Strode were the first black players in the modern NFL, and of course Jackie Robinson, everyone knows, broke the color barrier when he started playing for the Dodgers in the 1940s. There's another character in the film. Antoninus is another fictional character that is not from the historical record, comes from the novel, like a son to Spartacus, an educated enslaved person who is allowed to sort of help Spartacus with his, with the administrative tasks of the rebellion and so forth. But we see these characters, especially Varinia and Antoninus, as the two characters that are greatly loved by Spartacus and, of course, then are going to be challenged by Crassus. In 1960, again, under threats from the American Legion of Decency, a scene between Crassus and his new, young, gorgeous slave, Antoninus, played by Tony Curtis, a bath scene, was censored because of its suggestion of bisexuality. In the scene, Crassus asks Tony Curtis to scrub his back in the bathtub, and as a prelude to trying to seduce him, he runs away. He says, "Do you like snails or do you like oysters, right? Do you prefer one over the other? I like both snails and oysters." And I actually found this in the quotes. I don't think he actually ever really said this, Marcus Licinius Crassus, but it's in the movie, and so it's there. So when this scene, which was cut in 1960 under threats to the studio, was removed, they wanted to put it back in for the 1991 restoration. However, the scene, the print of the scene was discovered, but the soundtrack had been lost. And so in 1991, Laurence Olivier was deceased and could not redub his lines. Tony Curtis was almost 70 years old, came back and redubbed his lines, and during the scene, the voice of Crassus was mimicked by Anthony Hopkins, who was specifically chosen by Olivier's widow as one of the best mimics who could do Anthony Hopkins' voice. Most of the scenes, as I mentioned, from the historical part, most of the scenes of the army, the rebel army victories, were cut by the studio execs, the executives. So in the whole middle of the movie, you will notice that it's very hard to follow. It's cut very choppily, and it's hard to follow because all of a sudden you'll see a scene of them in battle, and then you won't know what happens, and then all of a sudden you'll see Spartacus, roughing up some Roman general, and you're not quite sure what's happened. So it's a little bit choppy there, but I just wanted to explain to you that is one of the reasons. Now, the final battle was shot not here in California, like most of the rest of the film, but in Spain. Stanley Kubrick was fascinated by these large-scale, sort of on-location shoots, and he did it. He literally enlisted 8,000 Spanish infantrymen to recreate Roman battle formations. This is not CGI. So when you watch this, kids, it's not CGI. It's real human beings wearing armor. Okay, so what you get in the film then when you watch it is a film that focuses on the final battle, which is the defeat of the rebels, right? You don't get all that stuff that we know from the historical record, which was that there were a number of victories that would have made, anyway, Kubrick and Douglas wanted to show more of those, but the studio executives, according to reports, became nervous about showing so much rebellion in the sort of late 1950s, context of American politics. So they were kind of worried about that. So all you get to see then is that the rebels lose the great final battle against Crassus, but they win a moral victory in the very famous scene where Crassus says, "If you give me your leader, I'll let all of you go." Of course, he was lying, but he says, "If you give me your leader, name the name, point out your leader, I'll let you all go." And then all of them all stand up and say, "I'm Spartacus," right? Again, a reference to Spartacus as an image, a reflection of the blacklisted creatives from that period. And I just want to show you, just a few months ago, I took this picture of the Universal Studios. I sneaked away the Universal Studios backlot where they shot that scene, and there's a hose there that's still called the Spartacus facade for the fire. I just thought it was kind of cute. Okay, so the final duel then, we see Spartacus having to duel to the death against Antoninus. Each one of them wants to kill the other one because the winner will get to be crucified. And of course, Spartacus ends up killing Antoninus in one of the most moving scenes in the film. So in the end, with this kind of chopped up film that we get with the very meticulous first act, shown in the Gladiator school. The central act, which is kind of chopped up, not showing a lot of the rebel victories. And then the final act, which focuses on this final defeat. You have to ask yourself, what does the film say? And that's what I was sort of suggesting, that it's a little ambiguous, it's a little divisive, and a little controversial to say, you know, what exactly is the message of the film? Is the price of freedom too high, right? Is the price of freedom martyrdom? So, you know, the film, I think, suggests in the cut that we have it anyway, and some of the battle scenes have been replaced in the 2015 version. In the 1991 version, not so much. But the film does sort of end up posing this question: is fighting the good fight enough? And then at the final scene in the film, again, we know from the historical record that Spartacus was killed in the final battle. His body was never found by all accounts. But in the film, we see this very religious scene, this very evocative religious scene where Varinia, now with their baby, little mini Spartacus, she goes up to the cross and she says, she looks up at him, and you can see, all of you who went to Catholic school like me, a combination here of the nativity scene of the mother in the blue robe, the Virgin Mary in a blue robe with a baby, holding a baby, and then the Mater Dolorosa standing in front of the cross. So it's like a mashup of the nativity and the passion. And when she looks up to him and holds the baby as he dies on the cross, and she says, Spartacus, if he lives, we all live, you know, your son is free, right? So again, very heavy on the religious imagery, perhaps to sort of, mitigate some of the depressing quality of the fact that the movie ends with the rebels failing in their goal to gain freedom. Looking forward from the film has also been very influential, born as it was out of a time of political activism in the 1960s, and has been influential ever since. Spartacus is still used today as a symbol of political activism. The famous Spartacus bookstore that's up in Vancouver, BC, which you can still visit. You can see that Spartacus is used as a name for a number of sports clubs all over, especially in the Eastern Bloc. We have one there from Bulgaria, one from the championship Moscow team. And the Ottawa Senators, by the way, did not know that. Their mascot is called Spartacat. So there is actually, and that's in the NHL, I think, in the National Hockey League. So we have some references in popular culture to Spartacus, and I think that these 90s references have to do with the re-release of the film in 1991, with the scene between Crassus and Antoninus, evoking the sexual themes of bisexuality and homosexuality. And so in the very open media landscape of 1990s LGBT representation, we see Agador Spartacus in the movie The Birdcage, where the character is called Agador Spartacus. In one of my favorite films, in Clueless, Cher falls in love with Christian, whom she does not know is gay. And what movie does he bring over to her house to watch that night? That is Spartacus, because he has a thing for her. Okay. And as we know, Spartacus was also used as a symbol of international gay culture as early as the 1980s and working its way through to today. Several revivals on screen and pages if you want to check them out. More novels about Spartacus, TV show about Spartacus, another TV show about Spartacus. All of these you can find on your Netflix or in your local Spartacus bookstore. And of course, Gladiators are totally on trend again with the new Ridley Scott film and the television, the new Gladiator show, Those About to Die, which just came out this summer on Peacock with Anthony Hopkins in that one as well. A number of books that you can find on Spartacus, a couple of them by me, and here is Kirk Douglas's memoirs that I've referred to a couple of times. And I just want to end, while we get started with the questions, show you this ad that was
show you this ad that debuted during the Oscars.
Okay, listen up. Someone leave their lunch at the last rest stop. There's a sandwich and we got a Pepsi. Still cold. Name on the bag says Spartacus. Is there a Spartacus here to claim this?
I'm Spartacus. I'm Spartacus. I'm Spartacus. I'm Spartacus.
I'm Spartacus. I'm Spartacus.
All right, well, thank you, everybody. Thank you very much.